Of all the CEOs of Legacy Auto, Jim Farley of Ford is the most open, often brutally honest, and he's just dropped a series of bombshells about the future of EVs and Ford itself. I'm Dave. Welcome to Dave Takes It On. And here I will be summarising what Jim said in that interview, and any quotes I show on screen are direct quotes, not edited, not cherry-picked, and not taken out of context. Well, the full NBC interview is up on YouTube for any who want to see the whole hour-long interview. Well, the interview began with a photograph of Jim Farley when he was 16 years of age, standing by his pride and joy, a Mustang muscle car, and he's a self-proclaimed petrol head. And he said that he'd built and rebuilt this several times as a teenager and then set off on a trip across America, and admitted that was even before he had a driving license. So he's a dedicated petrol head. He told us that he and his family have been dedicated to Ford throughout their whole lives. He showed a photograph of his grandfather, who was working for the Ford factory in 1914 and was employee number 389. That this was before Ford even got famous. And he apparently was complaining that when they went to mass production, the conveyor belt, he was really annoyed because up until then he'd be building whole cars, and then he was just building wheels. That was it. That was mass production. That was the production line. He said it was thanks to Ford that his mother actually went to college to put Jim where he is today. So he is a dedicated Ford man. And straight away the first bombshell. I quote, "If we don't make this EV transition, Ford's not going to make it. That's how important this is for our country. And I just wish more people would be talking about the experience of driving instead of the politics of the EV." Well, straight in with the big hitting ones. Ford might not make it if they can't transition to EVs. But it was what he said next about driving. He then talked briefly about the early adopters. He said at the time EVs came out, nobody knew anything about them. They didn't know the range of them. They didn't know the performance. They didn't know the insurance cost or the maintenance costs or how long the batteries were going to last. And he said these people just dived in at the deep end. And then he went on to say that we do actually now have all that data, so we can make much more informed choices. In 1909, he stated that the industry was 1/3 steam powered, 1/3 electric, and 1/3 combustion. And he says back then there was no guarantee that Henry Ford was going to win. We could easily have been having this conversation now about electric car, and why do we have to put this gasoline in our vehicle? He said it's amazing how precarious things were back then. And again, I quote, he says, I guess I've got to step back and reflect on what it's like to actually drive an electric vehicle, not for the save the planet apart, but everything else. The actual human experience of driving electric vehicles is wonderful. And for someone like a petrol head like me, who's family from Detroit, this is quite an admission. And we now know about running costs. And Jim Farley stated that it's actually 65% cheaper to buy electrons, i.e. electricity, than it is to buy gas. When asked about how soon this transition to 100% EV will take place, Jim says he believes that to be within the next 5 years. On the transition to EVs, Jim quotes, "Okay, so Ford was one of the first movers after Tesla to go into the EV business. We decided to electrify our 3 most iconic US company brands, the Mustang, our transit van, and the F-150. And we learned a lot. And we learned that if you just take your internal combustion engineers, supply chain and manufacturing people, and you ask him to make an EV, it's not going to be great. An EV requires completely different engineering to optimize around the smallest possible battery for the most affordability for customers. Aerodynamics has a huge impact on the way EV, far more than ICE cars, because the battery size has to be radically rethought. And the way we're doing this, we're thinking about it now, is not the body structure and then painted, then put in the seats, put in the powertrain. It's to build it right in front of you. And coming away now from Jim, this is exactly what Tesla has done right from the start, was looked at the manufacturing method and came up with what suited building an EV, not what could be adapted from building an ICE so it fits into an EV production line. And it's this difference that is so important. It's also, he's talking about the weight of a car and the efficiency of a car. And the weight of the car is critical. If you look at some of the weights of the cars, I'm not going to quote specific examples for anyone else, but for the Model Y, with all the advances in manufacturing technology, the weight of a Model Y today is round about 1,800 kilos, whereas the weight of an equivalent SUV, for example, Mercedes, BMWs or Hyundai or anything, is well over 2,000 kilos, and in some cases 2,500 kilos. So what that means is you need a very much bigger battery to be able to power it to go the same distance. And when you add a bigger battery, that adds more weight still to the car and it gets out of hand. And that's what happened with the gigacasting. It was something like 170 parts were going into the making of that particular component. And now they do it in one piece. It's much quicker, it's much cheaper, but it's also huge amount, much lighter, because that now is aluminium. And he touched very briefly on the number of employees. He was asked what impact is this going to have on a huge workforce, and he said, well, Ford has about 200,000 employees around the world, and they make vehicles every day. And so they've got a lot of experience of forecasting, shipping planning, a lot of tasks that others are struggling with. But they look at the tasks that humans can perform every day, and they're looking at AI and robots to try and take over some of that. So there is going to be a dramatic impact on the number of employees that legacy auto can actually sustain. And he also sees AI, artificial intelligence, as taking over from thousands of software designers and software engineers. And he was a very, very big proponent of being able to run your house off your car. So he talked about the Mustang Mach-E and the F-150 and vehicle to load, vehicle to grid. And he's saying that it's a no-brainer that you should automatically, if you're driving around with a huge amount of power in your car, you should be able to use that either by selling it to the grid or by running your house off your car. So if you come in at night and you just plug your car in, it will run your house, it will charge, and it will do everything automatically in the background, which will dramatically reduce the cost of running your house and your EV. And he went further when he talked about bidirectional charging. He says, I quote, "I believe this should be required for all electric vehicles. Why would you buy an electric vehicle and not be able to export the power? That seems selfish, frankly, and I think it's something that should be required for all companies making electric vehicles into the future." On robotaxis, he says, we're not there yet. He still thinks there's a good number of years away, certainly for Ford. And so he's talking about bringing in a much more advanced level 3, which is the one level below where the car is actually driving for you. So this is where you do need to sit in the car and you do need to be present, but not necessarily doing anything at the time. So that's his take on full self-driving, not for Ford at the moment. But the other direction he was looking for Ford to transverse into was the size of cars. And he says, we have simply got to get away from these absolutely massive gas-guzzling cars and start embracing smaller cars. And when he touched on to range anxiety, he said, When, this is a quote, when you actually look at how Americans drive, and we have the longest spaces, the average American only takes less than 4 trips, more than 150 miles in a year. The normal range, maximum range, even on a cold day now, is something around about 300 miles. So 95% of Americans would have no problem living with an EV and not really having to charge on the road very often with home charging. Now, it's going to be difficult to reply to this for all the EV haters, all the EV deniers, all the real petrol heads who really, really, really don't want EVs to succeed, because we have here the CEO of the world's largest EV maker, other than Tesla in America, and he is saying that the future of Ford is EVs. We've got to go EVs or we might not be around. And he's saying that for 95% of Americans, 150-mile range is all you need. 300, which is what you get nowadays, is absolutely more than adequate. And if you can link that into the vehicle to grid or vehicle to load, vehicle to home, then he says no-brainer. It's you come home, you run your car off electricity in the battery all night and all the time that your car's at home, and you charge up. It'll be AI controlled. It will only charge up when there's spare capacity on the grid and when there is low cost energy, i.e. overnight. So if I was to turn this on the head, what I would say to all you out there who hate the idea of EVs is help Jim Farley. Go and buy an EV and save Ford Motor Company from not being here within 5 years. Bit of a twist, isn't it? And he's there saying the experience of driving an EV is wonderful. That's a direct quote. It's wonderful. He says the acceleration, the performance, the silence, and most of all, he said it was being able to drive past those gas stations without having to stop. This is all just doing our job for us, those of us who love EVs. And here we have Jim Farley, CEO of Ford Motor Company, telling everyone EVs are great. EVs will suit 95% of you. There'll be 5% who won't. And he covers that a little bit later on in the interview, and I'm actually going to do a separate video on that particular subject because he does raise some very interesting things. But for the moment, I'm just going to leave it there. If you want to, I'll leave the link for the interview video down below. Have a look at it. It's well over an hour long, and there's a lot of stuff in there. But it's all very, very very positive for EVs. He touches on hybrids. Again, I'm going to do a separate interview on the hybrids and what he thinks is the way forward. And he also touches on things like biofuels, and he mentions Formula One. That's a hobby of mine. And that, again, will be a separate video. There's so much in this which is fitting in with what this channel has been saying all the way through. So to summarise, EVs are here to stay. Legacy Auto are going to have to adapt. If you don't adapt to EV and complete that transition, you won't be around. EVs are suitable for about 95% of the population. That's even in America, where they have huge distances. And that does mean, obviously, that 5% of the people at this stage, EVs are not for you. 5%. That is all. It's a tiny number. 95% of people, an EV is absolutely fine. And if he's done nothing else, getting that message across, that EVs will suit 95% of drivers, he's done a magnificent job. So thank you very much, Jim. Thank you very much, NBC, for carrying out this interview. And thank you, all the viewers, for listening to this. It's been done more in the style of a podcast. I've not put an awful lot of information up because I do know an awful lot of people listen to this in the background. And I also know an awful lot of people don't have more than an hour to sit and watch the whole of the interview to see what he says. So I hope you appreciate my abbreviation of the full interview. Thanks very much. I'm Dave.